Imagine you can turn back time. Not a few years, not a few centuries. You rewind 20,000 years all at once, and when you open your eyes, the world you know has vanished. Cities don't exist. Cultivated fields don't exist. Roads, bridges, the names of rivers, all of that belongs to a future that hasn't happened yet. What you see instead is ice. Ice in every direction, so high it hides the mountains behind it, so heavy it has sunk the continents beneath its own weight, so white that sunlight bounces off it and returns to the sky without warming anything. You stand on a world you barely recognize as your own, and yet this world is Earth. Your Earth. The same planet, in one of the many states it has passed through over its long and strange history. This is the Ice Age. Or more precisely, the coldest point of the last of the great glaciations that have shaped this planet over the past 2.5 million years. An epoch when ice wasn't a polar curiosity but the absolute protagonist of the planet, a silent and colossal architect that redesigned continents, moved mountains, opened passages between lands that today are separated by oceans, and forced everything living on Earth to adapt or disappear. It wasn't a single event or a sudden one. It was a slow process, rhythmic, governed by forces that operate on time scales that no human mind can directly experience, but that the record of rock and ice allows us to reconstruct with ever greater clarity. Tonight we're going to make that journey. Calmly, without hurry, letting each image form slowly in your mind as sleep approaches. We're going to walk through the Earth that was, to know the landscapes that vanished, to understand the forces that created them and those that unmade them. We're going to meet the animals that dominated that world and the people who lived in it, who painted it on cave walls with a beauty that still leaves us speechless. Because the Ice Age isn't just a page in a geology textbook. It's the world we come from, the mold that formed us, the stage on which our species learned to be what it is. If this kind of journey keeps you good company through the nights, subscribe to the channel and tell us from where you're listening to us tonight. It's beautiful to know there's someone on the other side, letting themselves be carried away by these stories. Let's start from the beginning. Or rather, from what it really means when we say Ice Age. There's a frequent confusion that deserves to be cleared up before we continue. When people talk about the Ice Age, in singular, they usually refer to a specific period, the last glacial maximum, which occurred approximately 20,000 years ago. But in reality, Earth has passed through multiple glacial periods throughout its history, cycles of cold and heat that repeat with a regularity that took us a long time to understand and name. The one we're going to explore tonight is the most recent, the one that ended just 12,000 years ago, the one that left visible traces in the landscape that we can still read today if we know where to look. Scientists call this period the Pleistocene. It began about 2.5 million years ago and ended 11,700 years ago, when the last great glaciation gave way to the warmer world we inhabit now. During that time, glaciers advanced and retreated in cycles lasting tens of thousands of years each. Cold, then warm, then cold again, like the slow breathing of a planet that sleeps and wakes at rhythms that no human being can perceive in a single lifetime. There were at least 8 or 9 major glaciations within the Pleistocene, each with its own character, its own extent, its own effect on ecosystems and the species that inhabited them. The cold didn't arrive suddenly. It came slowly, over thousands of years, so gradually that the animals living in those times didn't even notice it from generation to generation. Plants migrated south, following the heat that was retreating toward lower latitudes. Animals followed them. Glaciers advanced a bit each year, just centimeters, but never stopping, accumulating snow that didn't fully melt in summer, compacting it into ice under the weight of the layers above, spreading southward with the infinite patience of things that don't need to hurry because they never run out of time. And so, century after century, millennium after millennium, ice conquered territory, redesigned coastlines, changed the course of rivers, sculpted valleys that we today recognize as some of the world's most beautiful landscapes. The world of the Ice Age was, on its broadest scale, a world dominated by white. But looking closer, descending from the view from space down to ground level, you found that this white world wasn't uniform or empty. It had textures, colors, lives. It had winds that roared over open plains and silences that stretched for hours in sheltered valleys. It had seasons, though more extreme than ours, with short intense summers and winters that could last 8 or 9 months in the highest latitudes. It had sunrises that painted the kilometer-long ice fronts in pink and orange, making those walls of ice seem to pulse with their own light. It had winter nights when the sky, without the light pollution of any city anywhere on the planet, was a tapestry of stars so dense it seemed solid, so bright it cast faint shadows on the snow. It was a beautiful world. Brutal and beautiful at once, as almost everything is when seen with enough distance and enough calm. A world that lasted tens of thousands of years and ended, leaving as its legacy the landscapes we inhabit today, the rivers that feed us, the soil we cultivate, and something harder to name but equally real, a part of what we are. At the coldest moment of the last glaciation, approximately 20,000 years ago, the planet was a profoundly different place from the one we know. Global temperatures were between 4 and 7 degrees Celsius lower than they are now. That might sound small, like it's just a matter of putting on an extra sweater. But the difference between today's world and the world back then was as great as the difference between a garden in spring and a polar landscape in the depths of winter. A few degrees in the global average change everything. The winds, the rains, the ocean currents, the boundaries between ecosystems, the line where forest ends and tundra begins, the line where tundra ends and eternal ice begins. Ice covered approximately 1/3 of the planet's land surface. In the northern hemisphere, two great masses of ice dominated the landscape with a presence that today is hard to imagine because we have nothing comparable to compare them with. The first was the Laurentide ice sheet, which covered practically all of North America from the Arctic to where cities like Chicago, New York, and Seattle stand today. At some points, this sheet was more than 3 kilometers thick. 3 kilometers of ice stacked on rock. It was so heavy that it sank the Earth's crust several hundred meters into the Earth's interior, as if the planet itself yielded to that weight accumulated over centuries and millennia. That deformation, in some places, still hasn't fully recovered. Geologists call it isostatic rebound, and they can measure it. There are areas of Scandinavia and Canada that are still rising millimeter by millimeter each year, slowly freeing themselves from the weight of ice that disappeared 12,000 years ago. The second great mass was the Fennoscandian ice sheet, which covered all of Scandinavia, much of the British Isles, and extended eastward across what is today Russia to the Urals. Great Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavia were at that moment a single continuous stretch of ice, without coasts, without seas separating them from what is today continental dry land, because the North Sea as we know it didn't exist then. In its place was a broad, cold plain, crossed by rivers born from seasonal melt that carried water toward a sea that was further south and further west than today. In the southern hemisphere, the Antarctic ice sheet was also significantly more extensive than today, though Antarctica was already then, as it has been for millions of years, a continent covered in ice. The difference lay in the edges, in the amount of ice shelf extending over the ocean, pushing the frozen waters northward and altering global ocean currents in ways we are still learning to fully understand. And then there were the mountain glaciers, which weren't the continental monsters of the north but covered almost all of the world's great mountain ranges. The European Alps were buried under ice. Their valleys, which today harbor cities and highways and ski resorts, were then tongues of ice extending tens of kilometers onto the plains to the north and south. The Pyrenees, separating the Iberian Peninsula from France, were a barrier of ice and rock descending in glaciers toward the plains on both sides. The Cantabrian Mountains in northern Spain were crowned with glaciers feeding rivers much more abundant than those that today flow toward the Cantabrian Sea. The Andes, the Himalayas, the Rockies, the mountains of Norway and Iceland, all carried on their peaks and in their valleys masses of ice much greater than those remaining today, and those glaciers fed enormous rivers crossing landscapes that today are semi-arid or even desert. The world was colder, but also drier. Glaciers immobilized water as ice, and that water didn't participate in the evaporation and precipitation cycle that feeds continents. The great desert zones of the world were more extensive than today. The Sahara, already the world's largest desert, extended even further south and east. The deserts of Central Asia covered territories that today are steppes or grasslands. The Mediterranean was colder and more saline, with levels that didn't reach current ones. The Asian monsoon, which today brings rain to billions of people, was weaker and less predictable. The planet was breathing more slowly, more dryly, more quietly, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something that would take thousands of years to arrive. And yet there was life. Extraordinary life, adapted to conditions that seem extreme to us today, but which for the beings inhabiting them were simply the world, the only world they had ever known, the only one their ancestors had known for thousands of generations. Life didn't wait for conditions to be ideal. Life occupied every corner where conditions allowed it to exist, no matter how narrow that margin, no matter how hard the existence in it. There is something that few people imagine when they think about the Ice Age, and that is how different the geography of the planet was. Not just the interior landscapes, the tundras and steppes and glaciers, but the very shape of the continents, the coasts, the seas. What today are islands were then peninsulas. What today are straits were then plains. What today is underwater was then inhabited land, crossed by rivers, covered with vegetation, home to animals and people whose history has been submerged forever beneath the sea. The sea level was between 100 and 120 meters lower than today. That might seem like an abstract number, but its consequences were enormous and concrete and completely transformed the map of the world. The North Sea didn't exist. Great Britain wasn't an island. It was connected by dry land to what is today the European continent, and between it and Denmark extended a fertile plain that archaeologists have named Doggerland. It was a land that had rivers and lakes and gentle hills and forests of pine and birch, and which was inhabited for thousands of years by human communities that lived off hunting and fishing on its shores. Today we know almost nothing about them because their remains are under the North Sea, at depths of tens of meters, buried in sediments that preserve their tools and their bones and their hearths in a darkness that very few instruments have yet reached. From time to time, fishing boats working those waters bring up in their nets objects that shouldn't be there. Mammoth bones. Fragments of flint tools. The jaw of a woolly rhinoceros. Signs of a world that went under the sea 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, when the final melt raised the water level and the North Sea slowly filled, covering forever the plains that had been the home of people who left no name and left no written history because writing didn't yet exist. What they left is at the bottom of the sea, waiting for someone to find it. The Bering Strait, which today separates Alaska from Siberia with little more than 80 kilometers of cold, shallow water, didn't exist either. In its place was a strip of land more than 1,000 kilometers wide from north to south, an expanse of plain and tundra that scientists call Beringia. It was real land, not a simple narrow bridge between two continents, but a miniature subcontinental region with its own life, its own rivers, its own animal communities. And it was the corridor through which the first humans entered the American continent for the first time, following herds of animals migrating east in search of pastures that the cold hadn't yet exhausted. Exactly when this happened and how many waves of migration there were is still a matter of active scientific debate. The most conservative dates place the arrival of the first humans in America between 15 and 20,000 years ago. More recent and more controversial evidence suggests there could have been human presence on the continent up to 30,000 years or more ago. What no one disputes is the mechanism. Beringia was the door. And when the ice melted and sea level rose, that door closed forever under the waters of the Bering Strait, leaving Americans separated from the rest of humanity for thousands of years. In Southeast Asia, the islands that today form Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, some of them were connected to each other and to the Asian continent by expanses of dry land that today are under the Java Sea and the South China Sea. What today is an archipelago of thousands of islands was then a continuous mass of land, with mountains and rivers and jungles, that scientists call Sundalandia. It was a subcontinental region of considerable dimensions, comparable in extent to Western Europe, and which harbored human populations for tens of thousands of years whose history also went underwater when the sea rose at the end of the glaciation. Australia was closer to New Guinea than it is today, although the passage of water between them never completely closed, which means the first humans who arrived in Australia about 60,000 years ago had to cross the sea in some kind of boat, becoming thus the first long-distance navigators we have evidence for. It wasn't a casual journey. It required planning, construction of boats capable of sustaining several people for a journey of several days, and knowledge that there was land on the other side of the horizon. All of that 60,000 years ago, when in Europe Neanderthals were still the dominant humans and Homo sapiens had just begun its expansion out of Africa. The Mediterranean was also smaller and more enclosed, with coasts that today are underwater at depths of 20, 30, 50 meters. The cities the Greeks and Phoenicians founded on its shores, the beaches where Romans bathed, the ports where ancient traders loaded their ships, all of that was, during the Ice Age, several kilometers inland, far from a sea that was colder and more saline and ended at coasts that no longer exist. This different geography wasn't just a cartographic curiosity. It was the stage that defined how animals moved, how ocean currents circulated, how heat was distributed across the planet, and how humans from different regions of the world traveled and mixed. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the plain stretching south from the ice. It isn't a white desert. It isn't an empty, silent wasteland. It's something much more alive, much more complex, much more full of movement and sound than any European landscape has today. It is the mammoth steppe, as paleontologists call it, an ecosystem that has no exact equivalent in the modern world, a type of habitat that no longer exists anywhere on Earth and that we can only reconstruct from fossils, from analysis of pollen preserved in ancient sediments, and from the pictures our own ancestors left painted on cave walls tens of thousands of years ago. It extended from the Iberian Peninsula to the far eastern reaches of Siberia, thousands and thousands of kilometers of cold prairies, with hard, hardy grasses that survived winters we today would consider impossible, with low shrubs and plants adapted to soils that froze several meters deep but that in summer had enough life to feed tens of millions of large animals. With rivers that froze on the surface during the coldest months but that continued flowing underneath, feeding all that lived near their banks. With skies that in summer didn't darken for weeks at the highest latitudes, allowing animals to graze for hours that at middle latitudes would have been deep darkness. It was an ecosystem of extremes. The winters could be devastating, with temperatures of 30 or 40 degrees below zero and blizzards sweeping the plains for days without interruption. The summers were short but intense, with long days and an explosion of plant life that had to complete its annual cycle in just a few months before the cold returned. The animals living in that steppe had evolved to take advantage of these cycles, to accumulate fat and heat during the summer, to resist winter's cold with metabolisms adjusted to conditions that would have killed most modern animals. The woolly mammoth was the most emblematic of all. An elephant covered in long, thick hair, with curved tusks that could reach 4 meters in length, which it used to brush away snow and reach the grass buried beneath. It was large, much larger than African elephants today in many cases, with females that could weigh 4 or 5 tons and males reaching 6 or more. Its hair, which could be more than 90 centimeters long in some parts of the body, protected it from temperatures that could drop to 40 degrees below zero for weeks. It also had a thick layer of subcutaneous fat that acted as additional insulation, and small ears, much smaller than those of modern elephants, that reduced body heat loss. It was, in every sense, a machine perfectly designed to survive in the cold. Mammoths weren't solitary animals. They lived in family groups, like modern elephants, with the oldest females carrying the group's memory, remembering the paths to water sources, the routes of seasonal migration, the places where grass grew thickest after the snow. That memory, accumulated over decades in the matriarchs of the group, was the most valuable knowledge a herd could have. Without it, the group could get lost in the immensity of the steppe, arrive late to the summer pastures, be caught by an early storm on a wrong route. Together with the mammoth lived the woolly rhinoceros, an armored animal with an enormous horn over its snout, covered with hair so dense and so long it seemed to wear a wool blanket. Its fossils have been found from Spain to China, proof of how vast its distribution was in that world. There were also giant deer, whose scientific name is Megaloceros giganteus, animals whose antlers could reach 3.5 meters in span from tip to tip. That antler rack was so large and so heavy that simply bearing it required an extraordinary musculoskeletal system. Only males developed it, and they renewed it completely each year, investing in it more calcium than most animals dedicate to any body structure in their entire lives. Wild horses in herds that could number thousands of individuals crossed the plains following the seasons. Bison with horns longer than those of their modern relatives grazed in compact groups that moved following the best pastures. Musk oxen, which today only survive in the Canadian Arctic and Greenland, covered then a much broader territory. Reindeer in circular migrations that covered thousands of kilometers each year, following the spring thaw northward and the autumn ice southward. An abundance of life that today we find hard to imagine because we have nothing comparable to compare it with, no current ecosystem that gives us an idea of what it was like to see the mammoth steppe at the height of its fullness. Where there are large herbivores, there are large predators. The mammoth steppe wasn't just a world of peaceful animals grazing in idyllic meadows. It was also a world of hunters and hunted, of ambushes and escapes, of life and death alternating with a speed that the landscape didn't register and that only fossils, much later, allow us to sense. The cave lion was one of the great protagonists of that predatory world. It was significantly larger than modern African lions, with a weight that could exceed 250 kilograms in adult males. Its depictions in Ice Age rock paintings show it as a sleek animal, with powerful neck, without the prominent mane of modern African lions or with a much less developed mane. It lived in broad territories, capable of hunting large prey, and probably did so in groups like its modern relatives, although the fossil record doesn't allow us to know this with certainty. Its remains have appeared from Spain to Siberia, and in some sites juvenile mammoth bones have been found together with cave lion remains, suggesting that at least occasionally they attacked calves of the great pachyderms. The cave bear was another imposing presence in that world. It could weigh more than 400 kilograms, comfortably surpassing the modern polar bear. Its name comes from the fact that its remains are frequently found inside caves, where they hibernated during the winter months. Sometimes, those same places where bears slept were the same ones humans used as shelter or for ritual. The records of these cohabitations are preserved in layers of sediment that archaeologists patiently excavate. In some sites there are cave bear bones with marks from stone tools and stone tools among piles of bear bones, which speaks of encounters between the two species whose outcome could be very different depending on who found whom and under what circumstances. The spotted hyena of the Ice Age wasn't very different from the modern one in its anatomy, but its distribution was much broader. It lived in Europe, in Asia, across the entire extent of the steppe. It was a direct competitor with humans for the carcasses of large animals, and probably also for caves and shelters. The bones gnawed by hyenas found in prehistoric sites alongside bones worked by humans are the silent evidence of that competition, of that overlap between two intelligent and adaptable species that needed the same things. And in all that world of predators and prey, of life developing at scales no human could encompass with their gaze, there was also something smaller, more fragile, more improbable. There were humans. Our species, with bodies without hair or claws or fangs, with large brains and precise hands and the ability to learn and to transmit what they learned to the next generations. They weren't the strongest animals in that world, nor the fastest, nor the best physically equipped for the cold. But they were, by far, the most adaptable. And that adaptability was going to change forever the destiny of everything living in the steppe. The humans who lived in Europe during the Ice Age weren't a single homogeneous community. They were distinct groups, with their own traditions, their own hunting techniques, their own rituals and their own ways of understanding the world. Some groups specialized in hunting reindeer, following their seasonal migrations across hundreds of kilometers. Others hunted preferentially horses, or mammoths, or bison, depending on what was most abundant in the territory they knew and the season they found themselves in. Some lived mainly in caves during winter and moved to open-air camps in summer. Others were more nomadic, assembling and disassembling their shelters with each season, following the animals they hunted. And all, in one way or another, left traces in the archaeological record that still speak to us today, though sometimes with a voice we don't fully know how to interpret. The technology they developed was sophisticated for what we tend to imagine when we think of prehistory. Spear points carved in flint could have extraordinarily precise shapes, with sharp edges that surpassed many metals in cutting efficiency. The traps and collective hunting strategies they used to bring down animals much larger and stronger than themselves required a profound understanding of prey behavior and a capacity for coordination and communication that only articulated language makes possible. They were, in every way that matters, completely modern people trapped in a world that we, from our current perspective, would find almost unrecognizable. In 1994, 3 French cavers ventured into a system of caves in southern France, in the Ardèche region, following a cold air current coming from between the rocks, a sign that there was empty space on the other side. What they found on the other side would forever change our understanding of what the human mind was capable of tens of thousands of years ago. The cave walls were covered with paintings. Not clumsy scrawls, not meaningless marks. Paintings. Animals in movement, represented with a technical mastery that would do honor to any artist of any era. Lions in hunting posture, with neck muscles in tension. Woolly rhinoceroses facing each other, antlers interlocked. Horses at full gallop, with manes streaming. Mammoths with their long hair swaying as they walked towards some place the artist imagined but which we can no longer see. The cave was called Chauvet, in honor of one of its discoverers. And when scientists dated the paintings using radiocarbon techniques, the result was so astonishing that many researchers initially refused to believe it. The paintings were 36,000 years old. 36,000. They are the oldest figurative paintings we know in the world, and they are, without any doubt, works of art in the fullest and most exacting sense of that expression. The artists who painted Chauvet knew the animals they represented perfectly. They knew how they moved, how they held their heads, how they distributed their weight when they walked or ran. They knew how light affected the perception of volume, and they used the natural irregularities of the rock to give three-dimensionality to their figures, making a mammoth seem to emerge from the wall rather than being painted upon it. They used charcoal and ochre pigments and mixed the colors with animal fat to fix them to the rock. They worked by the light of small stone lamps that burned with animal fat and that produced a weak, flickering flame that made the animals painted on the walls move, giving them a life that perhaps was precisely what the artist sought. But Chauvet wasn't alone. Altamira, in Cantabria in northern Spain, was discovered in 1879 by Marcelino Sanz de Sacchuola and his daughter Maria, who was the first to see the bison on the cave ceiling. Its paintings are between 14 and 20,000 years old, and are of such extraordinary quality that when they became known to the scientific world, many specialists refused to accept that they could be prehistoric. It seemed impossible to them that human beings of that era could be capable of such a thing. It took decades to convince themselves that what they were seeing was real. Today, Altamira is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and every year thousands of people visit an exact replica of the cave because the original is closed to preserve the paintings. The original exists. It's there. But it's so fragile that we prefer not to breathe too close to it. Lascaux, in the French Dordogne, is 17,000 years old and is perhaps the most famous painted cave in the world, though today it too is closed to the public for the same reasons as Altamira. Its walls display scenes of extraordinary variety and richness. Horses, bulls, deer, rhinoceroses, bears, birds, a human figure. El Castillo, also in Cantabria, contains paintings and engravings that could be more than 40,000 years old, making it one of Europe's oldest decorated caves. Nerja Cave in Malaga has yielded dates that some researchers place at more than 60,000 years, which would make it the oldest in the world, though that scientific debate isn't completely closed. What all these caves have in common is something that transcends age and technique. It is presence. The feeling, when you see them, that someone was there, with a mind not very different from yours, looking at those same walls and deciding to leave something in them. Something that would last. Something that would tell a story. Something that would say, I was here, I saw this, I felt this. The artists who painted Chauvet and Altamira and Lascaux didn't know their works would last 30,000 years. But they created something worthy of lasting 30,000 years, and that tells us something about them that no archaeological data alone can convey. Our ancestors lived for tens of thousands of years in the heart of the Ice Age. Not as passive victims of a hostile climate, but as beings that were adapted, ingenious, capable of finding solutions to problems that no other species had faced in the same way. They were Homo sapiens, our species, which had arrived in Europe from Africa about 45,000 years ago, and which had encountered a world very different from the one they had left behind in the savannas and tropical forests of the continent they came from. Temperatures in winter could drop to 30 or 40 degrees below zero on the plains of northern Europe and Asia. There were no synthetic materials, no central heating, none of the resources with which we today combat the cold without thinking too much about it. What there was ingenuity, collaboration, and the accumulated knowledge of generations that had learned to survive in that specific world and that had transmitted that knowledge to their children and to their children's children in an unbroken chain of teaching and learning that extended for tens of thousands of years. Clothing was fundamental, and Ice Age humans didn't cover themselves with hides roughly tied around their bodies. Archaeological excavations have found bone and ivory needles of extraordinary fineness, with eyes so small that some researchers initially thought they couldn't be prehistoric. Those needles demonstrate that they were capable of sewing garments fitted to the body, with fine seams, with overlapping layers designed to trap warm air between them, with closure systems that could adapt to different conditions. Boots that had to seal out the cold from below. Gloves that allowed hands to be used with precision without exposing them to the freezing air. Hoods that left only an opening for the eyes and nose. The textile technology of the Ice Age was, in principle, as sophisticated as that used today by Arctic peoples who live in similar conditions, because the physical conditions are the same and there aren't many optimal solutions. To make that clothing they needed leather from animals, cured and softened until it became flexible and manageable. Leather tanning is a complex process requiring specific materials and technical knowledge transmitted from person to person. The stone scrapers found in Ice Age sites, tools carefully made for scraping fat and membranes from leather without damaging the skin, are the material evidence of that invisible work that made survival in the cold possible. Work that probably fell to people different from those who hunted, part of that division of labor that is the basis of any complex society. Dwellings were another key element of survival. Where there were accessible and well-oriented caves, they took advantage of them. But not all areas of the Mammoth Steppe had caves, and in those areas humans built their own shelters. In Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe, the remains of these constructions have been found. Cabins built with mammoth bones and tusks as a load-bearing structure, with jawbones driven into the ground forming the perimeter, femurs and skulls forming the support arches, and skin stretched over that structure as walls and roof. Some of these constructions could be several meters in diameter. They were real homes, with differentiated spaces for sleeping, cooking, storing. With hearths inside where fire burned for weeks and months. With personal objects and tools and ornaments that speak to us of people living in them, not just bodies taking shelter from the cold. The use of mammoth bones as construction material wasn't just a practical solution to the lack of wood on the steppe plains. It was also a form of relationship with the animal that largely defined the culture of those groups. The mammoth wasn't just food. It was material for building, for making tools, for creating art. Its ivory tusks were carved into figurines of great refinement, the famous Paleolithic Venuses that represent female figures with exaggerated characteristics that researchers interpret in many different ways, but which in any case demonstrate a capacity for abstraction and symbolic representation that is anything but primitive. Fire was the center of everything. Not just as a source of heat, although without its survival through Ice Age winters would have been impossible for a species without hair or sufficient body fat. Fire was much more than heat. It was light in the darkness of long winter nights. It was protection against predators coming too close to the camp. It was the instrument that made it possible to cook food, making it more digestible, extracting more nutrients from it in less time, reducing the risk of disease. It was the place around which the group gathered at the end of the day, where food was shared and collective decisions made and knowledge transmitted from one to another. keeping the fire alive was a responsibility that couldn't be neglected. In the absence of matches or lighters, starting a fire again if it went out required time and effort. Striking pyrite against flint to produce sparks, directing those sparks toward a bed of dry tinder, blowing carefully until achieving a flame. It was a process that could work under favorable conditions and fail miserably when the air was humid or the cold extreme. That's why they preserved the embers. They buried them in ash so they would survive through the night. They carried them in stone containers when the group moved from one place to another. They guarded them with the same care with which we today would guard something valuable and irreplaceable, because that was exactly what it was. Cooking transformed what they could eat and how they could digest it. Fire softens meat fibers, destroys parasites and bacteria, releases nutrients that would be inaccessible raw. Tubers and roots that raw are too hard or too fibrous become soft and nutritious when roasted or cooked. Bones, from which rich marrow fat can be extracted by heating them until the heat melts it from inside. Knowledge of how to prepare food was an essential part of the knowledge transmitted from generation to generation, as important as knowledge of how to make tools or how to follow the trail of an animal in the snow. Around the fire also was built the group's social life. Elders who could no longer hunt contributed their experience, their memory of past winters, the knowledge accumulated over decades of observing the world. Young people learned by listening and watching and doing. Children grew up in that environment of shared knowledge, absorbing from an early age the names of plants, the habits of animals, the signs of weather, the stories that gave meaning to the world. That flow of knowledge from generation to generation, around the fire, in language, was culture. Not culture as an ornament to life, but culture as a condition of survival. There is a question that archaeological remains answer with less clarity than we would like. What did Ice Age humans do during the long darkness of winter, when the days lasted only a few hours and the nights seemed to go on forever? We know they didn't simply huddle around the fire and endure. The amount of art, carved figurines, tools with elaborate decoration, adorned bone pieces that have been found in sites occupied during the coldest months suggests that winter was also a time of creative activity. Perhaps because there was less opportunity for hunting when storms made it dangerous to venture far from shelter. Perhaps because the group had more time to spend together, sitting around the fire, working with their hands while they talked. Perhaps because the long nights naturally invite the creation of stories and symbols and the working of materials into shapes that please both the maker and those who see them. The astronomical knowledge of Ice Age people is something that's still being studied and debated. Some researchers have suggested that certain markings on bone and antler from Ice Age sites might represent lunar cycles, marks made as the moon passed through its phases, but other researchers question this interpretation. What does seem clear is that Ice Age people were careful observers of the sky. They lived without artificial light pollution, under skies where the Milky Way was clearly visible and the planets moved in patterns that anyone who paid attention could perceive. Whether they organized this knowledge into something resembling what we call astronomy is still unclear, but they certainly looked up, and they saw. Religious beliefs and practices are even harder to infer from the archaeological record than daily activities. We don't know if the figurines that have been found, the small carved women, the animal figures, were objects of worship, teaching tools, toys, good luck charms, or something else entirely. Some researchers have proposed that certain caves with no evidence of habitation might have been ceremonial or spiritual spaces, where rituals were performed away from the day-to-day camp. The handprints that appear in some caves, created by placing a hand against the wall and blowing pigment around it, have been interpreted as signatures, as shamanic experiences, as claims of territory, as rituals of initiation. We simply don't know. But the fact that we don't know doesn't mean nothing significant was happening. The elaborate care that went into these objects and places, the fact that resources were invested in activities that had no immediate practical value, suggests that Ice Age people lived in a world that contained layers of meaning beyond simple survival. They had symbolism. They had beliefs. They created meaning. All things end. Even the Ice Age ended, though it took thousands of years for that ending to complete itself. The process wasn't smooth or linear. It was marked by advances and retreats, by periods of sudden warming followed by returns to cold, but the overall trajectory was clear. The ice was melting. The transition from the last glacial maximum to the world we inhabit now took place largely between 20,000 and 10,000 years ago. It wasn't a single event but a cascade of changes, each triggering others. As temperatures rose, the ice sheets that had covered enormous areas began to melt. The meltwater, pouring off the glaciers in vast quantities, ran into the oceans, raising sea levels. With higher sea levels came the flooding of the low-lying lands, including Doggerland, that had been dry when the sea was lower. The climate changes triggered changes in vegetation. Plants that had been confined to small refugia in the south began to migrate north again, following the retreating ice. The tundra gave way to taiga, the boreal forest of stunted trees adapted to cold climates. Temperate forests advanced northward. The steppe began to fragment, breaking into smaller and smaller patches as the climate warmed and humidity increased. The great herds of grazing animals that had dominated the mammoth steppe for tens of thousands of years began to decline. Not all at once, not everywhere simultaneously, but the overall trend was clear. The extinctions of the megafauna at the end of the Ice Age have been debated for generations. Did climate change alone cause them? Did hunting by humans play a role? Probably both factors contributed, and their relative importance may have varied by region and by species. In North America and South America, large animals like mammoth, mastodon, giant sloth, and saber-toothed cat disappeared within a few thousand years of human arrival. In Europe, the megafauna declined more gradually. In Australia, where humans had arrived much earlier, the extinctions had occurred tens of thousands of years before the end of the glaciation. What we can say is that the end of the Ice Age marked the end of a world. The landscape transformed. The plants changed. The animals changed. The humans who lived through that transformation had to adapt or disappear. Some human populations flourished in the New World. Others faced severe hardship. Along the coast, as sea levels rose and the ocean became more productive, coastal populations developed new food sources based on marine resources. In areas where forests expanded, humans developed new hunting and gathering strategies based on forest foods. In what would become the Fertile Crescent, around 11,000 years ago, something revolutionary happened. Humans began deliberately planting seeds, selecting for plants that had larger seeds or better nutritional value. Agriculture was invented, not as a dramatic breakthrough but as a gradual process of selection and experimentation. The Neolithic Revolution, as it's sometimes called, transformed everything. Settled agriculture allowed human populations to increase. It allowed specialization. Not everyone needed to be a hunter or gatherer. It allowed the accumulation of surplus, which could be stored, traded, or used to support non-productive members of society. It created the conditions that would eventually lead to civilization, to cities, to writing, to all the complexity of the world we inhabit today. But this transformation took time. It took thousands of years for agriculture to spread from its centers of origin. For the first people who adopted it, farming was probably harder than hunting and gathering. Early farmers were shorter, had more diseases, suffered worse nutrition than the hunter-gatherers they replaced. But they had one advantage. They could support more people on the same piece of land. Over the long term, that advantage proved decisive. Farming spread. The world changed. And that change, which began in the last millennia of the Ice Age, continues to reshape our world today. The success of humans during the Ice Age wasn't accidental. It came from a specific combination of biological capabilities and learned behaviors that allowed us to thrive in conditions that would have killed other primates within days. Temperature regulation is one of these capabilities. We can sweat to cool down and shiver to warm up. We can acclimatize to cold by increasing metabolic rate if we're exposed to it long enough. Our skin, though not thick or furred like other mammals adapted to cold, is still capable of remarkable feats of adjustment. When exposed to cold, blood vessels in the skin constrict, reducing heat loss to the environment. When we move, Muscles generate heat. All of these mechanisms, combined with cultural inventions like fire and clothing, allowed us to survive temperatures our ancestors in Africa had never experienced. But beyond these biological capabilities, what really allowed humans to thrive in the Ice Age was intelligence, and specifically the ability to learn, to transmit learned knowledge, and to plan for the future. The capacity to make tools, to improve them over generations, to transmit tool-making techniques from parent to child was crucial. The ability to predict where animals would be in a few months and to plan hunts in advance was crucial. The ability to remember and communicate information about the landscape, about seasonal changes, about dangerous places and good places to hunt. All of this pointed toward increasing dependence on culture, on learned, transmitted, accumulated knowledge, rather than on genetic evolution. Biological evolution works, but it works slowly, over many generations. Culture works quickly. A technique invented by one person can be learned by everyone in the group within days or weeks. A tool design can be improved on, variations can be tried, and the best ones kept. This is how human beings became the dominant species, not through having the biggest teeth or the strongest muscles, but through having the best toolkit for learning and passing on information. The development of language was probably the biggest step in this process. Language allows for the communication not just of immediate needs and warnings, but of abstract ideas, of the future, of things that don't exist in the immediate environment. Language allows you to plan an elaborate hunt, not by pointing at the animal you want to hunt, but by discussing the strategy before the hunt begins. Language allows you to tell your children stories about places you've never been, about times before you were born, about ways of doing things that someone else invented. We don't know exactly when human language became as complex as modern language, but by the time we have evidence of art and elaborate tools in the archaeological record, it seems clear that people had language capable of expressing quite abstract ideas. The fact that someone took the time to carve a mammoth figurine with exquisite detail suggests they had concepts of aesthetics, of beauty, of meaning. The fact that people traveled hundreds of kilometers to obtain shells to make into necklaces suggests they had concepts of trade, of value, of identity. It's easy to think of Ice Age humans as a monolithic group, all living in the same way, all facing the same challenges. But the reality was far more diverse. Human cultures during the Ice Age adapted to their specific environments, and those adaptations produced enormous variation in how different groups lived. In the Mediterranean region, where the climate was somewhat milder and more humid even during the glaciation, humans developed hunting and gathering strategies different from those of the mammoth steppe hunters. The fossil record shows that people hunted ibex in the mountains, fish in the coastal areas, and mixed terrestrial and marine resources in a way that suggests sophisticated knowledge of seasonal availability. In the tropical regions of Southeast Asia and Australia, humans were adapting to forests and coastlines, not mammoth steppes. By 50,000 years ago, people in Southeast Asia were making sophisticated stone tools and presumably fishing, based on the evidence of fish hooks and other materials found in archaeological sites. The early Australians developed hunting and gathering strategies that successfully utilized the unique Australian fauna, which included the now extinct megafauna but also many smaller animals and plants suited to the arid and semi-arid climates of the interior. In what would become North America and South America, humans were adapting to diverse environments. Some groups became specialized hunters of large animals, developing hunting techniques and weapons suited to taking down megafauna. Others exploited more diverse food sources. By the end of the Ice Age, humans had spread throughout the Americas and had developed sophisticated adaptations to every environment from the Arctic to the tropical rainforests to the high altitudes of the Andes. These diverse cultures, separated by thousands of kilometers and in some cases tens of thousands of years, developed independently but followed similar patterns. They developed tools. They developed hunting strategies. They developed ways of organizing and transmitting knowledge. They created symbols and meanings beyond the immediate demands of survival. What unites all these Ice Age cultures is the evidence of intelligence, of creativity, of the capacity to understand and to shape the world around them. What differentiates them is the specific choices each culture made, the specific solutions they found to the specific problems posed by the specific environments they inhabited. The image of Ice Age people as isolated groups living in small territories bounded by geography and climate is too simple. Evidence increasingly suggests that there was contact between distant groups, exchange of goods, movement of people across vast distances. The shells used to make necklaces in Ice Age Europe often came from the Mediterranean or the Atlantic, hundreds of kilometers away from where they were used. This suggests either long-distance trade networks or at least seasonal movements of people that covered enormous distances. The obsidian used in some Ice Age tools sometimes came from volcanic sources hundreds of kilometers away. This is harder to explain than shell trade. Why would you carry stone when stone was available everywhere? But it suggests that certain materials had value that went beyond their practical utility. Some researchers have suggested that there were patterns of seasonal movement that covered enormous distances. A group might hunt in one location for part of the year, then move to another location for a different part of the year. Over the course of a year, a group might cover hundreds of kilometers. Over the course of a lifetime, individuals might travel thousands of kilometers. This would have brought people into contact with others, would have allowed for exchange of goods, knowledge, and possibly genetic material. The art styles found in caves and on portable objects suggest both local variation and surprising similarities across large distances. There are regional styles that appear to be unique to particular areas. But there are also motifs and techniques that appear in similar forms across huge areas, suggesting either contact between distant groups or at least the adoption of ideas and techniques from distant sources. This picture of Ice Age human society as more connected and more mobile than earlier theories suggested has profound implications. It suggests that humans were not simply adapted to their immediate local environment, but were capable of and interested in maintaining contact with distant groups. It suggests that ideas and innovations could spread widely. It suggests that Ice Age humans lived in a world that was complex socially and intellectually in ways that the simpler images of early human life might not capture. One of the most poignant lines of evidence for the inner lives of Ice Age people comes from burial sites. When humans began to deliberately bury their dead, rather than leaving them to be scavenged, they were saying something about how they understood death and the relationship between the living and the dead. Neanderthal burials from before the arrival of modern humans already show signs of deliberate placement, sometimes with grave goods, objects placed with the body. When Homo sapiens arrived, burial practices became more elaborate. At some sites, bodies were buried with ornaments, with tools, with animal bones. This suggests beliefs about an afterlife or at least a desire to honor the dead with objects that had meaning to the living. One particularly moving discovery is a young boy, about 10 years old, buried in Austria around 24,000 years ago, surrounded by mammoth ivory beads and flint tools. The effort required to make those ivory beads suggests that considerable time and resources were invested in preparing the child for burial. Why? The most likely explanation is that the child had significance to the group, and the group wanted to honor that significance. Another example is a woman buried in Russia about 23,000 years ago wearing a clothing sewn with hundreds of ivory beads. The work required to sew so many beads into a garment represents many hours of labor. Was this clothing worn by the woman during her life? Or was it made specifically for her burial? We don't know, but either way, it speaks to a desire to honor the dead, to mark their death with something beautiful and meaningful. These burial practices tell us something important. Ice Age people understood death as something significant. They didn't treat the dead as merely used-up containers to be discarded. They treated them as individuals who mattered, whose passing was worthy of ritual and remembrance. This capacity for mourning, for honoring the dead, for creating rituals around death, is something distinctly human. And it was present in Ice Age humans just as it is in us. The technological sophistication of Ice Age humans is often underestimated. We tend to think of stone tools as primitive, forgetting that shaping stone into the forms required for specific purposes requires skill, knowledge, and practice. Blade technology, the production of sharp, thin blades from prepared cores, allowed for efficient use of stone. A single piece of flint the size of a fist could yield dozens of blades, each sharp as modern surgical steel. These blades could be hafted, attached to wooden or bone handles, to create composite tools. A blade attached to a wooden shaft with sinew became a lance. Blades could be arranged in rows in a bone handle to create a saw or a sickle for cutting plants. Bone and antler technology was highly developed. Ice Age people carved bone into harpoon points with barbs designed to catch and hold in flesh, into fish hooks, into needles for sewing. This bone technology required understanding of the properties of different bones, knowledge of which bones worked best for which purposes, and the ability to shape them precisely. The invention of the atlotl, the spear thrower, was a major technological advance. It's a simple device, essentially a lever that extends the throwing arm and adds speed to the projectile. But it was an enormously important innovation. A spear thrown by hand could reach a certain distance and speed. A spear thrown with an atlotl could reach much farther and move much faster. For hunters trying to bring down large animals, the atlotl was a game changer. Later, toward the end of the Ice Age, the bow was invented. The bow was even more powerful than the atlotl and offered the additional advantage of being quieter. But the bow also required considerable skill to make and use. It had to be carved or bent into exactly the right shape, strung with sinew, and arrows had to be fletched and pointed. The knowledge required to make and maintain a bow probably represented a significant investment of teaching and learning. All of these technologies, the refined stone tools, the bone and antler work, the composite tools, the weapons, represent accumulated knowledge. Individual innovations could have appeared in one person's mind. But the persistence of these technologies across generations and across large geographic areas suggests that they were actively taught and transmitted. This transmission of technology from generation to generation is part of what defines human culture. What Ice Age people ate shaped not just their survival but their culture and even their biology. The foods available in different seasons and in different environments determined where groups lived, how long they could stay in one place, what skills they needed to develop. In the mammoth steppe, the diet was heavily based on large animals: mammoth, bison, horse, reindeer. But this didn't mean eating only meat. The large herbivores that dominated the steppe fed on grasses and shrubs. An understanding of plant foods was part of Ice Age ecological knowledge. Seeds, roots, bulbs, berries, all were part of the diet when available. Archaeological evidence suggests that women may have specialized in gathering plant foods while men specialized in hunting large animals, though this division of labor was probably not absolute. The preparation of food was sophisticated. Meat could be roasted over a fire, boiled by heating water with hot stones, or preserved by drying or smoking. The marrow inside bones is rich in fat and calories. Early humans learned to split bones with stone tools to access the marrow. They learned to use every part of an animal. The hide became clothing, the bones became tools or buildings, the sinew became thread or string, even the bladder or stomach became a container for carrying water or storage. Plant foods required knowledge to prepare safely. Some roots are nutritious only when cooked. Some plants have toxic compounds that can be reduced or eliminated by processing, soaking, heating, fermenting. The evidence from archaeological sites suggests that Ice Age people had developed techniques for processing plant foods that reduced their toxicity or improved their nutritional value. The development of cooking, and the understanding of nutrition that went with it, had profound effects on human health and behavior. Cooked food is easier to digest, and cooking destroys many parasites and pathogens. Cooking allowed humans to extract more nutrition from a given amount of food, which could support larger populations. And the knowledge required to prepare food properly was one of the forms of knowledge that had to be transmitted from generation to generation, usually through teaching and imitation. Ice Age people must have experienced the same diseases, injuries, and illnesses that affect humans today. And they must have developed remedies and treatments, though we can only infer this from fragmentary evidence. Archaeological evidence shows that some Ice Age people suffered from injuries that healed, suggesting successful treatment of broken bones and wounds. One skeleton from Italy shows a healed arm fracture that would have rendered the arm useless. The fact that the person survived for years after the injury suggests that the group cared for the injured person, providing food and protection while the arm healed. This implies knowledge of bone setting, or at least recognition that wounds need to be protected from infection and kept clean. Plant medicines may have been known and used. Modern hunter-gatherer societies use a diverse array of plant medicines, and it's plausible that Ice Age people did as well. Some plants contain compounds that are genuinely effective at reducing inflammation, treating wounds, or alleviating pain. Others are known to promote healing or reduce fever. But we have no direct evidence of Ice Age plant medicine use. One fascinating piece of evidence comes from the discovery of medicinal plants in a Neanderthal burial site. The plants included yarrow and marshmallow, both of which have medicinal properties. Whether the Neanderthal deliberately placed them there or they were accidentally included in the burial is debated, but it at least suggests the possibility of Neanderthal knowledge of plant medicine. Dental problems must have been common, especially in the later Ice Age as diets shifted toward foods that were harder on the teeth. Some Ice Age skeletons show evidence of tooth abscesses, which would have caused pain and infection. Without antibiotics or modern dentistry, such infections were dangerous and could be life-threatening. We don't know how Ice Age people dealt with dental problems, but they must have developed techniques to manage the pain and control infection. When did human language become modern? This is one of the most hotly debated questions in the study of human evolution. Did anatomically modern humans who arrived in Europe 45,000 years ago already have language as complex as ours? Or did language develop gradually over the hundreds of thousands of years since humans first split from our common ancestor with Neanderthals? The evidence is ambiguous. We have no way to directly observe the language spoken by Ice Age people. Bones don't preserve sound, but we can look at behavior. The creation of art requires the ability to communicate about abstract concepts. The planning of elaborate hunts requires the ability to discuss future possibilities. The transmission of knowledge about plant processing or bone setting requires the ability to describe techniques and explain why they work. All of these behaviors are present in Ice Age societies and present in abundance. So we can confidently conclude that Ice Age people had language capable of expressing abstract ideas, describing the future, and teaching complex procedures. Whether their language was in all respects identical to modern language we can't know. But it was certainly advanced enough to support their complex societies. There are also neurological arguments to be made. The human brain hasn't changed much in the last 50,000 years. The brain of an Ice Age person transported to the modern world would be capable of learning modern languages, mathematics, and science just as quickly as a modern person born in the present. The cognitive capacity for language was almost certainly present. What probably developed gradually was the diversity and complexity of specific languages, the accumulation of vocabulary, the refinement of grammatical structures. Modern languages have hundreds of thousands of words and complex structures for expressing relationships between ideas. Ice Age languages may have had smaller vocabularies and simpler structures. But the fundamental capacity for language, the ability to produce and understand a grammatically complex system of symbols, was almost certainly present. The use of symbols, objects that stand for something other than their physical presence, is intimately connected with language. The shells worn as ornaments were symbols of identity. The marks made on bone and antler were symbols that may have represented the passage of time or the achievement of hunts. The paintings in caves were symbols, an image standing for the animal depicted. The ability to create and understand symbols is the foundation of both language and of human culture more broadly. And so we arrive at the end of this journey. Not the end of the story, because the story doesn't end. The planet keeps turning. The ice remaining at the poles still responds to the same cycles that determined past glaciations. Sediments still accumulate on the bottoms of oceans, preserving in their layers records of this moment we are living, so that millions of years from now, if something is here to read them, they can know that here was a species that burned fuel and built cities and painted images and asked itself questions about time and cold and what the world was like before it arrived. You are here, at this particular moment in Earth's history. A moment that on the geological scale is absolutely invisible in its brevity, but from within it is everything. It is all there is. It is the only point from which you can ask the question and contemplate what came before. The Ice Age isn't just an epoch that passed. It is the context from which we come. The routes by which your ancestors reached the continents we inhabit, the climate that pressed our species toward innovation and cooperation, the caves where human art took its first recognized steps, the glaciers that carved the valleys many of us live in, the rivers born from the melt that still feed the cities we built. All of that is heritage of the Ice Age. All of that is part of what we are, even when we don't see it as we look at the world around us. The mammoths disappeared. The glaciers retreated. The lands connecting continents went under the sea. The great animals that dominated the prairies for millions of years are no longer here. But the forces that created all of that remain active. Tectonic plates still move. Earth's orbit still varies. Volcanoes still release carbon. Oceans still absorb heat. The planet still breathes, on its slow and vast scale, indifferent to the haste of the world that lives on its surface. The hands with which we point at the sky, the hands with which we paint and sculpt and build, are hands that evolved during the Ice Age to handle stone tools and throw spears and tan leather. The brains that solve abstract problems and build models of the world and plan the future are brains that evolved to solve the concrete and immediate problems of surviving in a world that could kill you if you made a mistake. The tendency to gather around fire, to tell stories, to share food, to care for the sick and the elderly, to transmit knowledge from generation to generation. All those things we call culture and consider distinctively human were formed in Ice Age camps, around hearths that burned in caves and in cabins built from mammoth bones. There is something in the darkness of night that makes these ideas fit together in a special way. When the world's noise fades and thoughts slow down, become calmer, more willing to accept that there are things bigger than yourself. The Ice Age lasted for tens of thousands of years. The humans who lived through it didn't know they were in a geological epoch. They had no name for what they lived through. They only had the cold, the ice, the fire, the herds of animals they followed, the caves where they spent the winter, the stars above their heads on nights clearer than ours, without light pollution, without cities, without anything between them and the sky. What did they think about when they looked at those stars? What did they feel when they painted a mammoth on the cave wall, by the light of an animal fat lamp, in a silence broken only by the drip of water and the sound of their own breathing? We don't know. And there is something beautiful in not knowing, in that distance remaining, in those lives being so ancient that time has made them almost transparent, as if they were made of the same matter as dreams. Because that is what we are too. We are what remains from everything that came before. The improbable result of billions of years of change and adaptation and extinction and resurgence. We are the living memory of a planet that doesn't remember anything because it has no mind, but that carries its entire history written in rock and ice and in the genes of the beings that live on it. Tonight, as sleep arrives, think about that. About the cold that once covered the valleys where perhaps you live. About the sea that once occupied the plains that today are fields and cities. About the animals that walked the same earth you walk on, thousands of years before any human gave that place a name. About the people who sat around a fire on a glacial winter night and looked at the flames and thought things we will never know. The planet keeps turning. The ice remaining at the poles reflects the light of a moon that the first humans who crossed Beringia toward an unknown continent also saw. The stars that shine above your head tonight are the same ones that guided the groups following herds across the frozen steppes of Europe and Asia 20,000 years ago. None of that has truly disappeared. It only has changed form. Like everything on this planet, matter doesn't disappear. It transforms, finds new configurations, new ways of existing. You are one of those forms. A form that thinks and feels and asks itself questions in the darkness of night. A form that for a brief instant contemplates the enormous time that precedes it and the enormous time that will come after, and finds in that contemplation something much like peace. That is enough. More than enough. Let sleep arrive. The climate of the Ice Age wasn't uniform. It wasn't simply a world colder than ours everywhere and all the time. It was a climate with its own dynamics, with its own seasonal and regional variations, with zones that were extraordinarily cold and dry and others that, surprisingly, were relatively mild and humid for their latitudes. Understanding this variability is essential to understanding how species, including ours, survived in a world that from a distance seems uniform but which up close was as complex and varied as today's. The Mediterranean, for example, was colder and drier than today, but it wasn't the frozen wasteland one might imagine. The coastal regions of southern Iberia and North Africa maintained conditions sufficiently mild to be refuges of life for many species that had been displaced from higher latitudes by the advance of ice. The pines and oaks that today cover much of Europe survived the glaciation in those southern refuges, in what ecologists call glacial refugia. From there they recolonized the north when the climate improved, following the retreating ice and occupying soils recently freed from the weight of glaciers. The genetic analyses of current European tree populations still show traces of those recolonization routes, with genetic differences between northern and southern populations reflecting the isolation they suffered during glaciation and the routes they followed when expanding northward again. The winds of the Ice Age were different from today's. With the great ice sheets of the north acting as enormous cold surfaces, the temperature difference between the equator and the poles was greater than it is today, and that made atmospheric pressure gradients more pronounced, winds stronger and more persistent. Dust storms and sandstorms were more frequent in arid regions, and the dust they raised was transported thousands of kilometers before settling. Those loess layers, that fine yellowish sediment covering vast expanses of Central and Eastern Europe, China, and Argentina, are among the world's most fertile agricultural soils, a direct inheritance of Ice Age dust storms. The loess that makes the Ukrainian plain one of the world's most productive granaries was deposited by winds between 20 and 10,000 years ago. Ocean currents were also different. The thermohaline circulation of the Atlantic, that conveyor belt of warm and cold water that today carries heat from the Caribbean northward to Europe and is responsible for the climate of the British Isles and Norway being much milder than their latitude would suggest, functioned differently during glaciation, weaker and with a more southern route. This contributed to the cooling of northern Europe and the North Atlantic, creating an effect that amplified the initial astronomical cooling. Precipitation followed patterns different from today's. The African monsoon, which today brings rain to the Sahel and parts of North Africa, was much weaker during glaciation, contributing to the Sahara being larger and more arid. But in other regions the situation was different. The interior of Central Asia, mostly arid today, received during certain periods of glaciation more precipitation than it does now, feeding lakes that no longer exist or that are much smaller. The Caspian Sea was significantly larger. The Aral Sea, today in rapid decline due to human activity, was then a much vaster expanse of water. This regional variability makes talking about the Ice Age as a single uniform climate state necessary for popular communication but inadequate for deeper understanding. It was a world with its own differentiated climate zones, with its own atmospheric and oceanic circulation dynamics, with temporal variations within the glaciation lasting thousands of years that had important consequences for the animal and human populations living through them. Within glaciation there were colder periods and relatively warmer periods, called interstadials, during which ice retreated temporarily and ecosystems reorganized before cold returned. One of the best known is the Balling-Alarod interstadial, which occurred between 14,700 and 12,900 years ago, just before the Younger Dryas, during which the climate of northern Europe improved significantly for several centuries before cold returned abruptly. Understanding this variability also helps us understand why some human groups prospered at certain times and in certain places while others disappeared. Periods of climate improvement within glaciation were moments of expansion, of colonization of new territories, of greater resource availability. Periods of extreme cooling were moments of contraction, of population concentration in the most favorable refuges, of greater pressure on available resources. The human history of the Ice Age isn't a story of linear progress, but a story of continuous adaptation to an environment that never stayed still long enough to take anything for granted. There is a question that archaeologists have debated for decades without reaching a definitive answer. What did the cave paintings mean to those who created them? It's not an easy question. The artists who painted Chauvet and Altamira and Lascaux left no text explaining their intentions. We can't ask them. We can only look at what they did and try to understand, from our inevitably modern perspective, what could have motivated them. One of the most influential theories, developed by South African researcher David Lewis Williams, suggests that cave paintings were related to altered states of consciousness, possibly induced by prolonged fasting, hyperventilation, or consumption of psychoactive plants. In these states, the human brain tends to generate characteristic visions including dots, spirals, lines, and geometric shapes that can transform over time into representations of animals or other figures. Cave paintings, according to this theory, would be representations of these visions, created in places thought to be portals between the ordinary world and the spiritual world. The cave walls wouldn't be canvases but membranes, surfaces through which the artist accessed another world and from which animals emerged. It's a theory with both defenders and critics. Some researchers find it convincing because it explains several aspects of the paintings that are otherwise difficult to understand, such as the preference for the darkest and most inaccessible places of caves, or the presence of negative handprints, created by blowing pigment around a hand placed against the rock, which could be interpreted as touching the world on the other side of the wall. Others criticize it because it applies concepts from the spiritual traditions of known cultures to a culture we don't know directly. What does seem clear is that painted caves weren't ordinary places for those who used them. They weren't simply shelters where people lived and decorated the walls out of boredom. The choice of the deepest, hardest-to-reach places, the presence of primitive musical instruments like bone flutes found in some sites, evidence of rituals repeated in the same places over generations. All of this suggests that these caves were special spaces, separated from everyday life, used for something that went beyond immediate survival. And that, in itself, is something extraordinary. Because it tells us that Ice Age humans didn't live only in the world of the immediate and the practical. They lived also in a world of the sacred, the symbolic, the transcendent. They had cosmology. They had ways of understanding their place in the universe that went beyond knowing where the best pastures were or how to follow a mammoth's tracks. That symbolic dimension of human existence, that capacity to create meaning beyond immediate survival, is perhaps the most distinctive characteristic of our species. And it has its roots in the dark caves of the Ice Age. Music was also part of that world. Flutes made from vulture bones and mammoth ivory have been found in sites in Germany between 35 and 40,000 years old. They are the oldest musical instruments we know. They can still produce notes when played. Someone made those flutes carefully and skillfully, carried them to caves where people gathered, and played them while light flickered on the painted animals. That music was lost 40,000 years ago. We can't recover it. But the instruments that remain tell us it existed, that there was rhythm and melody in that world of ice and mammoths, that beauty wasn't a luxury but a necessity. Personal ornaments found in Ice Age sites also speak to identity and symbolic communication. Necklaces of seashells found hundreds of kilometers from the sea, showing there were trade networks connecting groups separated by great distances. Stone beads of various colors requiring hours of work to be pierced and polished. Figures carved in mammoth ivory with care and attention to detail that had no practical function. All of that is culture in the deepest sense of the word, the set of symbols and shared meanings that defines a group and distinguishes it from others, that gives its members a sense of belonging and identity that goes beyond purely biological needs. We are children of the Ice Age in a sense that goes far beyond metaphor. The selective pressure that the extreme climate exerted on our ancestors for tens of thousands of years left traces in our biology that we can still detect if we know where to look. The capacity to accumulate fat, which in today's world is a source of health problems for many people, was during the Ice Age a survival advantage. Individuals who could store energy efficiently during times of abundance, summer and autumn, and survive periods of scarcity, winter and late spring when resources were harder to obtain, were more likely to reach the next season of plenty and have offspring. The human tendency to gain weight easily when food is available is partly a legacy of that selective pressure. Our metabolism is calibrated for a world of intermittent scarcity, not the world of permanent abundance many people live in today. Lactose tolerance in adulthood, which is not universal among humans but varies greatly among populations of different geographic origins, is another example of recent adaptation. Most mammals stop producing lactase, the enzyme that digests lactose in milk, after weaning. Humans originally did too. The ability to continue digesting milk in adulthood is a mutation that appeared only 8 or 10,000 years ago in populations that had domesticated cattle and sheep, and that spread rapidly because in climates where periods of scarcity were long, being able to drink the milk of domestic animals was an enormous advantage. It's not the Ice Age directly, but its outcome, the transition to herding that the stability of the Holocene made possible. The social structure of humans, our tendency to live in groups of intermediate size, neither too small nor too large, with complex kinship and cooperation relationships that go beyond the immediate family, also has its roots in the Ice Age. Groups that were too small were vulnerable. If disease or accident eliminated the most skilled hunters, the group might not have the capacity to survive the winter. Groups that were too large were unsustainable. The resources available in the territory a group could exploit couldn't feed too many people. The optimal size for a group of hunter-gatherers in the Mammoth Steppe was probably between 20 and 50 people for daily activities, with alliance networks that could connect several hundred or even thousands of people at special times like major seasonal gatherings. Those gatherings were fundamental. They were the moments when groups that had spent the winter separated came together in known places, exchanged partners, exchanged information, exchanged objects. They were the moments when the alliance network was renewed and reinforced, when the social bonds that allowed asking for help in times of scarcity were established and maintained. Archaeological sites showing unusual concentrations of objects from different origins in the same place. Shells from different seas, flint from different deposits, pigments of colors not found in the region, are probably the remains of these great seasonal gatherings. Places where for days or weeks a year the social life of an entire region was concentrated. That capacity to maintain complex social networks, to remember obligations and bonds with people we don't see for months, to plan future meetings and prepare for them, requires a type of social memory and perspective thinking that is specifically human. And that type of thinking, which we today use to plan business meetings or maintain friendships with people living in other countries, evolved for a very specific and very critical function. Surviving Ice Age winters in collaboration with groups that were distant enough not to compete directly for the same resources, but close enough to be reachable in case of need. Everything we are carries the marks of that process. Not just biologically but culturally, in the ways we organize our societies, in the values we consider fundamental, in the narratives we tell about who we are and where we come from. The Ice Age isn't just history. It is the condition that made us possible. There is a moment in human history that deserves to be contemplated with special care, because it is perhaps the boldest of all those witnessed by our species during the Ice Age. The moment when the first humans crossed Beringia and set foot on a continent where people had never been before. A continent that from that moment on would cease to be virgin forever. Beringia wasn't just a narrow passage between two continents. It was an extension of land that at its greatest width could be more than 1,000 kilometers from north to south and that connected Siberia with Alaska across what today is the Bering Strait. It was land itself, with its own climate, its own vegetation, its own animals. The tundra and steppe covering it harbored mammoths, bison, horses, moose, and caribou, and the human groups living on its eastern margins found in it not only a corridor but a habitat that sustained them during generations as they ventured, perhaps without knowing it, into the New World. The debates about when the first humans arrived in America have occupied archaeologists for decades and still aren't completely resolved. For a long time, the dominant consensus placed arrival around 13 or 14,000 years ago, with the Clovis culture, whose creators produced spear points of extraordinary technical craftsmanship that are found distributed throughout North America. Clovis points are so characteristic and so precise that archaeologists recognize them immediately when found, and for decades it was thought that they represented the first American culture. But in the last 30 years, an increasing number of sites in North and South America have produced evidence of human presence before Clovis, in some cases several thousand years earlier. The Monte Verde site in Chile has solid dating of 14,800 years ago, meaning that humans were already at the southern tip of South America before Clovis appeared in the north. This implies that initial arrival must have occurred earlier, with sufficient time for populations to spread from Alaska to Patagonia. There is also more controversial evidence of human presence in America 30,000 years or more ago, especially in Brazil and Mexico, which if confirmed would imply a history of American settlement much longer and more complex than previously thought. Most archaeologists receive these with skepticism, because the dating methods and interpretation of materials are debated. But the debate remains open, and each new discovery adds complexity to a history we thought we knew well and that turns out to be much richer and much older than we believed. What we do know is that the first Americans arrived as hunters and gatherers, adapted to northern conditions and capable of surviving in extreme climates. And that upon arrival they found an extraordinarily rich world of large animals that had never seen humans and had therefore not learned to fear them. American mammoths, mastodons, American horses, American camels, giant tapirs, ground sloths 6 meters tall, glyptodonts the size of a Volkswagen, terror birds 2 meters high. A megafauna without parallel in any other continent, perfectly preserved for millions of years in the absence of a predator as effective as modern humans. The encounter between these two worlds, the world of hunters arriving from the north and the world of giants waiting without knowing they were coming, produced one of the fastest extinctions in the paleontological record. Within a few thousand years, most of these animals disappeared. It wasn't a deliberate massacre. It was the inevitable result of the encounter between a hunting efficiency without precedent and a fauna that had had no evolutionary time to develop the avoidance behaviors that would have protected it. The story of the conquest of America by the first humans is a story of extraordinary success and of extraordinary loss, inextricably entwined. And yet, something survived. The cultures that the first Americans developed on that continent during the next 12 to 15,000 years were extraordinarily diverse and rich. From the Arctic hunters who learned to live in conditions that would have killed almost any other animal, to the agricultural civilizations of Mesoamerica and the Andes that built pyramids and cities and writing systems and astronomical calendars of astonishing precision. All that diversity, all that cultural richness, has its roots in that moment when the first humans crossed Beringia and ventured into the unknown continent, perhaps following the animals they hunted, not knowing that they were making history. There is a practice that geologists call thinking in deep time. Not the time of human history, measured in centuries and millennia. Not the time of prehistory, measured in tens of thousands of years. But the time of Earth, measured in millions and billions of years. A time so vast that the human mind cannot really comprehend it, only represent it symbolically and work with it as if it understood. Deep time changes perspective in a way that's hard to describe but easy to feel when you experience it. When you think of the Ice Age as something that happened 20,000 years ago and lasted 100,000, and then you think that Earth is 4.5 billion years old, the Ice Age becomes something that happened just an instant ago in geological terms. The blink of an eye. A fraction of a second in the life of the planet. And yet, in that blink, everything we are emerged. Language, art, technology, complex social cooperation, music, ritual, cultural memory, the ability to plan the future years in advance, the ability to imagine worlds that don't exist and work to create them. All of that, in evolutionary terms, is extraordinarily recent, and all of that arose, in large measure, in response to the pressures of the Ice Age. Deep time also changes the way we see the present. If the Ice Age was a blink, our current moment is something even more fleeting. The Industrial Revolution is 200 years old. Agriculture is 10,000 years old. Writing is 5,000 years old. All of recorded history, everything we call civilization, fits into something that in the geological record is almost invisible. And we, at this moment, are adding our own layer to that record. The sediments that are accumulating now at the bottom of oceans and in peatlands and in lakes will bear the traces of this moment for millions of years. The carbon isotopes altered by fossil fuel burning, the plastic particles that will never fully degrade, traces of radioactive elements of human origin, the thin but unmistakable layer that will mark in the geological record the moment when one species became a geological force. That isn't necessarily catastrophic. It's simply real. We are what we are. An extraordinarily powerful species that emerged from the conditions of the Ice Age, that learned to survive and thrive in extreme conditions, that developed the ability to modify its environment in ways no other species had been able to do before. That ability to modify is what saved us during the Ice Age. It's what allowed us to survive the hardest winters, the longest famines, the most abrupt climate changes. And it's also what makes our presence on the planet so transformative, for better and for worse. The question that deep time asks us, when we contemplate it with honesty, isn't whether we'll survive or whether the planet will survive. The planet will survive. It has survived Snowball Earth and 5 mass extinctions and asteroid bombardments and volcanic eruptions that darkened the sky for centuries. The question is what kind of world we're going to leave when we finished acting, and whether that world will be one in which something resembling what we are today can continue to exist. That's a question the Ice Age cannot answer for us. But it can give us some perspective on it. It can remind us that we are a species that has survived tremendous things. That we crossed the Ice Age, literally, on foot, with wooden spears and skin clothing. That we painted the world on cave walls when the world was ice and mammoths. That we crossed oceans on rafts and found continents that nobody knew existed. That we invented writing and agriculture and medicine and quantum physics. We are, with all our flaws and all our inconsistencies, an extraordinarily capable species able to adapt and create. And that same ability that made us the protagonists of the Ice Age is what makes us responsible for the world that comes after. Not as blame but as possibility. Not as condemnation but as opportunity. Deep time teaches us that things change, they always change, and the most transformative changes aren't always the ones that seem most dramatic when they happen. The first humans who crossed Beringia didn't know they were changing the world forever. The artists who painted Chauvet didn't know that 36,000 years later someone would be looking at their work and feeling moved by it. Neither do we know what of what we do now will last. What of what we build will survive long enough for something or someone to find it a million years from now. But what we do know, what the Ice Age teaches us with a clarity that no argument can deny, is that time is long, life is persistent, and the ability of living systems to reorganize and continue after the most extreme changes is something that far exceeds what any human mind can imagine. The planet is still here. The ice that remains at the poles is the last vestige of the glaciation that formed the world we inhabit. The stars that shine above your head tonight are the same ones that illuminated mammoth hunters in the icy steppes of Europe 20,000 years ago. The water molecules in your body have been in the glaciers that covered the Alps and in the rivers that ran when the ice melted and in the oceans that rose and covered Doggerland forever. You are part of a cycle that began long before you existed and will continue long after you cease to exist. That isn't sad. It is, if you think about it calmly. In the darkness of night, when sleep is arriving, one of the most extraordinary things you can feel. Deep time is a gift. The ability to contemplate it, to feel it, even if only for an instant before sleep arrives, is part of what makes us human. That ability to be amazed at our own smallness, to find beauty in what surpasses us, to feel something like gratitude for existing at this particular moment in a history so long and so strange and so full of life. That too comes from the Ice Age. That too we learned around the fire, on the longest and coldest nights of the world that formed us. Let sleep arrive.